Erin. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. What is the Cold War, you might be wondering? Well, during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies to defeat the Axis powers. But following the war, the relationship between these two countries became very tense because the Soviet Union believed in communism and wanted to spread it, while the United States believed in democracy. The Cold War occurred from 1945 to 1991. How did the communists come to power in Czechoslovakia, though, you might be wondering? Czechoslovakia was one place that had a strong democracy during the World War II, but in the 1930s, it faced challenges from both the West and the East. Our country experienced a hard period of depression during this time, so the U.S.-sponsored Marshall Plan intended to help us rebuild our country, but the Soviet Union blocked the plan. Edvard Benz, who was the leader of Czechoslovakia at this time, tried to hold our government together. However, the Soviet Union took over. By 1948, in February, the communists had forced Edvard Benz and his political parties out of the government. On February 25th, Benz gave in and handed over his cabinet to the Communist Party. Following in May, rigged elections were held to validate the Communist Party here in Prague. But what was life like for all of us? It was very hard. Our country has experienced a terrible depression following the war, and so has the rest of Europe. In 1968, our country experienced many reforms, and we had some hope that something might be able to happen for the better. But the Soviet Union believed in communism and socialism, and so all the changes did not really help us. We experienced a loss of jobs, and many people were feared if they were to speak out against communism for their safety. We also experienced we no longer experience the freedom of assembly and freedom of the press. Now, to talk about more events at this time, I'm so glad to have McClain Jung here. Come on in, McClain.
Good morning. Thanks, Erin. Good morning, Czechoslovakia.
Have some coffee.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm here to give a little bit of a weather forecast and timeline info.
Perfect. I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Well, all right. Good morning, everyone. So let's begin when the Soviets gained control in 1946. So during World War II, the Soviet troops occupied Czechoslovakia and was put under the communist dictatorship after the war was over. The Soviet Union's goal was to force Czechoslovakia into the communist rule, and that was how it politically began the Cold War in Czechoslovakia. So looking at our second piece for the timeline, we began in 1948, and it began the effort to secure communism in Czechoslovakia. So the communist leaders within the country arrested non-communist members and completely overthrew the government. Many officials at the time were arrested and replaced if they spoke out against the rule at the time. So then we moving on to our third piece of the timeline, the Brezhnev Doctrine. So jumping ahead now to February of 1968, the Brezhnev Doctrine was established and written by Premier Brezhnev, the General Secretary of the USSR, and announced to the whole world that the Soviet Union would not allow any Eastern European country to reject communism. So the fourth event we will be discussing is the Prague Spring. So 1968 was a big year for Czechoslovakia. As relating to my last point about the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Prague Spring was temporary liberation from the communist views at the time. So Brezhnev wanted to get his message across the people, and on August 20th, 1968, about the Brezhnev Doctrine, the Prague Spring was temporary liberation from the communist views at the time. So Brezhnev wanted to get his message across the people, and on August 20th, 1968, he took his troops from the USSR and stormed the streets of Prague, as well as airports and the streets of the capital. This is a well-known event because the citizens of Czechoslovakia did not retaliate. In fact, they put flowers on the soldiers' head. A big leader at this time was Alexander Belchek, and he came into power in 1968 as appointed and wanted to give Czech citizens freedoms that the USSR did not approve of. So keep moving forward to 1989, and our final event is the Velvet Revolution. So Czechoslovakia began to have a huge power shift after peaceful student protests in Czechoslovakia. This was another big year for our country, because communism was soon diminished within the country and it became a democracy once again. So let's focus in now on Brette with more information on the event, who is live at the scene. Good morning, Brette.
Thank you, McClain. As she was saying, the Velvet Revolution originally began as a 50-year commemoration of the martyrdom of Jan Opletel on November 17th. Opletel was a student at Charles University Medical School and was killed during the beginning of the Soviet regime here in Czechoslovakia. Many young students continue to see him as a father of the resistance movement. These events soon transformed into an anti-communist protest. The protesters continued on to Windsor Square. Here the protesters were soon met to the beatings of the police. Rumors state that one was killed during these beatings. Soon later, Havel called a meeting of the Charter 77, which is a group of activists later formed into the Civic Forum. This organization earlier wrote a manifest that called for human rights for the people of Czechoslovakia. These men and women took actions and made public demonstrations which would lead to the events of today. Their leader, McClain Havel, was a poet, playwright, and author who would use his talents to speak up for the people of Czechoslovakia. Later, the Civic Forum came out from the 2-hour meeting and called for a 10-day strike following the commemoration. Now I am outside the Capitol. We have just heard news that the entire Politburo and the Soviet regime has finally surrendered to democracy. I cannot believe this day has come. The entire streets are filled with cheering. This is a great day for Czechoslovakia. Back to you, Erin.
Thank you, Brette, for that wonderful live witness report. Well, that's a wrap for our show today. Thank you, Czechoslovakia. Till next time.